I grew up in a storytelling family. My great-grandmother, it's going back a fair while, but I can remember as a small child, she used to come to our place every single week. Every weekend she'd come. And at that stage, I now have a brother and sister, but at that stage I was just an only child. And she would take me, we'd go walking down to the local bushland, which was just a couple of blocks away from where we lived. You know, that was in the old days where you didn't really have parks, you just had bush, so we were in the bush. And we'd sit on an old log or a tree stump, and she would tell me stories from the old days, you know, story after story after story. Go forward a few years, and my grandmother, so her daughter, would also tell stories, but it was a little bit different because my grandmother was a great cook. And so in the old days, some of you will remember this as well, you used to have the kitchen table in the kitchen. And that's where you would do your cooking as well as your eating and pretty much everything else as well. And so my grandmother would gesticulate with knives and all sorts of things in her hands while she was telling these incredible stories from the old days while she was cooking at the same time. Fast forward again to my mum. My mum will be 88 this year. And every time I visit my mum, I was there just the other day, she's a great storyteller. And she tells me stories from the old days, like her mum and her mum. But also she tells me about her stories of today. So her friends and what's happening and what she's doing. She goes to Jonathon Baptist and she's very involved there. So you can see that I came from a storytelling legacy. And what's really interesting to me is that as I've looked back over the years, I'm not altogether convinced that the stories of my grandmother and great-grandmother had all the facts exactly right. So my grandmother, for example, said to me when I was a small child, I was booked to be on the Titanic. And I thought that was a great story. And she told me this whole story about how she was booked to be on the Titanic, but obviously didn't get on it because she was still alive. Well, years later when I did the figures in my head, I thought, okay, so she was alive in 1912. She was probably a very small child. I can't remember the exact year she was born. But there's one other big problem, and that was that she was in Australia. And I don't think the Titanic really came anywhere near Australia. And I reckon my great-grandmother was the same. You know, she told some great stories, but they stretched the truth a little bit. My mum, I'm not sure, and I'm not prepared to say because she's still around. So, and I don't know, some of you might even know her. I know there were a couple of people in the first service who actually knew her. But, you know, one of the things that I realised when I think back to those stories was that whether they were the truth or whether they were not the truth, a bit stretched, they captured my imagination. I could sit there for hours and listen to these incredible stories that my mum tells today and my grandmother before her and my great-grandmother. I think the mantra was never let the truth or never let the facts get in the way of a good story. But the story was incredible. You know, you can recount to someone a few facts and you might have their attention for a few minutes, but if you tell them a great story, you'll have their attention for a long, long time. We went and saw a movie a couple of nights ago, and one of the things that captured me about the movie was it was just a great story. And I came away, and I'm still thinking about it 2 days later. You know, it was an incredible story that captured my imagination. I think in Western culture, you know, one of the problems we have is that we're very consumed with facts and figures. You know, I can't count the number of times when people have said to me, just give me the detail. I'm not interested in the story. I don't want to hear about that. Just give me the details. In my job at Morling, particularly my Director of Research role, what I'm often doing is sitting with people and listening to their story of how they came to the point where they want to do further research. But it's no good me just saying to them, just give me the transcripts, just tell me what course you want to do and we'll get you in. It doesn't work that way. They want to tell a story, and I'm very privileged to actually hear that story. Before I taught at Morling, I was in ministry, church ministry for 15 years, and one of the greatest remembrances I have of that time and privileges was listening to people's stories. It wasn't always easy. You know, sometimes people had really traumatic stories, really difficult stories to hear, but they were important stories. And most importantly, they were their stories. And telling stories was a very, very powerful thing. Now, of course, the Christian faith is full of stories. You read through the Old Testament, story after story after story. Read through the New Testament, story after story after story. What was Jesus' preferred way of getting his message across? Through stories. He told story after story after story. I don't know, but, I can't imagine anyone ever said to Jesus, can you stop telling us stories? Just give us the facts and figures. We just want to know the stuff. That's the important thing. I get the feeling that if Jesus were around today, maybe we might be a bit like that. Just give us the important things, the important points, the executive summary. That's all we really need. Some of you, if you've been in church for a long time, like me, might remember 2 hymns that we used to sing. Tell Me the Old Story, it's the title of the sermon this morning, and we've a story to tell to the nations. The Christian faith is founded on stories, and of course, most importantly for Christians, the story of Christ, the story of Jesus. That is the foundation of our faith. If we don't have that story, we don't have a story. We have nothing to tell the nations. We have nothing to remember. For Jewish people, if they didn't have the story of the Exodus being brought out of Egypt from slavery, then they don't have a story. And more importantly, I think, they don't and we don't have an identity. Because our identity, who we are, comes largely from the stories that we tell. So let's have a look at some of the stories that some of the things that people say about telling stories. We all have stories to tell. And if we had the time today, we'd never end, I guess, with a group this large, but we could go around and we'd all have stories to tell. But here's what a few people have said about stories and storytelling. Cameron Jace says, a storyteller makes the past a present and the present the future. I had to think about that one for a bit. A good storyteller and a good story brings together the past, the present and the future and weaves it together. Dorrit Sasson said, the storyteller's gift is not just the tale, not just the story itself, but the spark it ignites in the hearts of those who hear it. That was the spark for me. I didn't realise it at the time, but when I listened to my great-grandmother and my grandmother and now my mother, who were all great storytellers, facts aside, I thought to myself, even as a young person, I want to be a storyteller. I want to be able to tell stories like that capture people's imagination. And for Christians, we have these stories ready-made. We don't even need to create the stories because they're there for us. But the third quote here, I think is really relevant to what I want to talk about this morning. Through storytelling, we weave the tapestry of our shared human experience, one generation to the next. What we witnessed earlier in the service this morning here with these child dedications was a profound and sacred moment. The privilege that we have as parents and grandparents, and some of us just in the church community surrounding these young children, the privilege we have to be able to tell and retell the story and invest in their lives so that they too might find their own faith in Christ is just incredible. I've seen it with my own children. Many of you have seen it with your children and grandchildren. It's just the greatest privilege that we have. Weaving lived, shared experience, the story of the gospel from generation to generation. That last quote, as I said, reflects a practice that I want to think about this morning, weaving our shared human experience one generation to the next. There are many psalms that do what Laura Packer talks about, this weaving together. They recount the shared human experiences of the people of Israel in different ways, and they pass them on from generation to generation. And they do it for very good reasons. Which brings us to Psalm 78 that I want us to look at this morning. It's a long psalm. It's the second longest psalm. If you're familiar with the Psalms, you'll know that Psalm 119 is a whopper. It's huge, 176 verses. Well, Psalm 78 is not quite that large, but it's still a very big psalm. And so we don't have time this morning to explore everything that's in this psalm. But if you read it through, and you would have got an inkling of it as we had the reading this morning of those first 8 verses, it tells a really important story the story of the Israelites. And what is that story? It's a story of a people who didn't have a God, but they were called into relationship by Yahweh, who became the God of Israel. And they walked with that God through thick and thin, through good times and bad times. And as they did that, they discovered three really important things. They discovered that this God loved them. Now you might go, yeah, well, of course, we know God loves us. But for ancient people, they didn't believe in such a thing, that gods could love people. Gods were just like big police officers in the sky, do the wrong thing, squash you. If you read Greek mythology, the gods really only were interested in humans when the humans were causing problems for them. And then the gods would retaliate. So the idea of a God being loving was something totally foreign to ancient people. But they learnt that after they were called into relationship with God. They also learnt that this God was able to be trusted. When this God said something, this God did that. Not a capricious God who kept on having a change of mind, which again was something very common in the ancient world. And the third thing was that this God was faithful. This God would stick with these people no matter what. Whether it was good, whether it was bad, whether it was indifferent, God was always there. God would always turn up. That's a summary of the story as a whole. And it's introduced here in verses 1 to 8. And what I want to consider here is, rather than the story itself, I want to consider why the psalmist thinks it's valuable to tell this story in the first place. Why tell this story at all? And so we're going to look at three reasons, and they're here in these verses. You may have noticed them already. The first thing the psalmist does is grabs our attention, and it's really unfortunate. Those of you who have maybe English as your second language, or maybe you've learnt another language, and you'll appreciate this, that when you translate into another language, you pretty much always lose something of the meaning. And that's what's happened here, because when you come from the Hebrew into the English, you kind of lose something. The psalmist says in English, "My people hear my teaching, listen to the words of my mouth." Literally, in the first part there, "my people hear my teaching." In the Hebrew, it has the idea, the imagery of detaching your ears and giving them to the speaker. That's how I want to listen. I give my ears to you. Fill my ears up so I can hear the story. So it's a little bit weak in the English. And the second part there, "listen to the words of my mouth," it's literally, again, stretching out your ears to hear what the psalmist is saying. It's more than just hearing. You woke up this morning where I happen to live. I have a lot of trees around near where my bedroom window is, and there's always a lot of birds in the trees. And I hear the birds, and I hear some traffic, and I hear people walking past, especially now the weather's getting a bit finer, and talking, and I hear kids laughing. But do I ever stop and listen carefully? Well, sometimes I do. But there's a difference, isn't there? Just hearing it and actually paying attention to it. That's what the psalmist is trying to get across here. The psalmist wants us to hear, to listen, to be attentive to the story that's going to be told. And it's an interesting psalm because it's a prayer, so the psalmist is praying it to God, but at the same time wanting people around to hear and listen to the story. So it suggests that the story is being, or the prayer is being prayed aloud, so that others can hear. And here the person says that this story, they call it a parable, and that's really interesting. You'll remember the parables that Jesus told in the New Testament. And one of the tricky things about a parable is that the meaning is not always obvious. So you might remember there are a couple of occasions where the disciples heard Jesus tell a parable, and they said to Jesus afterwards, can you explain the parable to us? Because we didn't quite get it. And Jesus would explain it to them, and they still wouldn't get it. Because that was the point. You see, you have to work at it. You have to work at Jesus' parables to figure out what Jesus was saying. Jesus was not going to do all the work for the listeners. And it's the same case here. We know the story, we've heard the story, but you need to do some work to deeply understand the story. Stories can make darkness light. Stories can make what is misunderstood clearer. This is stuff that has to be heard and known. But interestingly, it's not new. The psalmist actually says here in Psalm 78, you've heard these stories. You know these stories. Or do you really know these stories? So what are these things that they've heard before and they've been told? But like I said, as I summarised earlier, this is a story of God who's loving, a God of relationship, a God who can be trusted, a God who turns up, a God who is faithful. And in Psalm 78, we have a great example of telling the old story. It's not a new story, it's a story that's retold. And you'll notice in these verses the emphasis of telling this story to children and children's children. That goes right back to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, one of the things that God communicated to the people through Moses was it's important for you to tell this story to your children and your children's children. Again, that's why what we were doing this morning is so important. Because if we don't tell our children the stories, who will? You know, someone will tell our children stories. It's just a question of who tells the stories and what stories they tell. So as Christian parents, grandparents, family members and friends, we have a responsibility. Towards the end of these opening verses, we're reminded of something that I think is critically important, that we continue to tell this story over and over. For people of faith, there are very good reasons for us to keep telling the story of how God interacted with people in the past. And one of the very good reasons is because God continues to interact with us now. I don't know about you, I have a few things during the week that I do which are not connected with Christian people or churches at all. And I do that intentionally because I work in a Christian context and I'm surrounded by Christians, which might send me a bit crazy if that's the only thing I did. So they're good Christians, but, you know, it's nice to have other people outside that. So what I notice when I talk to people in these other contexts, most of them actually believe there's a God. Did you know that? Most people in Australia actually believe there's a God. About 80%, I think. So most of them believe there's a God. But if I said to them, does the God you believe in do anything, like in the world on an everyday basis? They go like, what? No, I've never heard God speak. I've never seen anything that seems to suggest there's evidence of God. But telling the old story for us reminds us that we believe in a God who is in the world. God's not out there, some distant place and detached. God's actually here by God's Spirit, active and alive in us, in the church, and in the world in which we live. So there are three reasons that the psalmist gives for the importance of telling the story. And I'll just go to, there we go. Why tell the story? Well, first of all, so that they may know. I want to unpack these for a few minutes. Secondly, so that they set their hope on God. And thirdly, so that they do not forget. Now, just stop there because you might be thinking, I know all that stuff. Or do we? And that's why I want to unpack them for a few minutes today. The first thing in verse 6, so that they may know. The first reason for telling the story. Know what? Know the facts, know the details. You might know when Jesus lived. You might know when the people came out of Egypt from slavery. You might know lots and lots of stories. I grew up in Sunday school. I know all the stories in the Bible. I know the facts and figures bit. But again, there's something lost in the language here. Because what the psalmist is saying is here, it's important to know the story, as in have an intimate experience of the story yourself. Now you might be saying to me, well, how could I ever have a personal experience of the story of the Exodus? People coming out from Egypt. I don't know what it's like to be in slavery. I don't know what it would have been like to live in the second millennium BCE, 2,000 years before Christ. I can't identify with that. I can't even really identify with the story of Jesus. I don't know what it would have been like to live in first century Palestine. So, how can I experience and live that experience myself? Well, let me give you an example of how some people do that. You may be aware that every year Jewish families celebrate the Pesach Seder, the Passover ceremony or Passover service. And what's interesting about that, usually happens around Easter time. Sometimes they coincide, sometimes they don't because it's a different calendar. But one of the things that they do is the father in the household, so it's always celebrated in the house, it's not a church service as such. And the father of the Jewish family will retell the story of the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, being released by God, being delivered by God out of slavery. But here's the interesting thing about it. When the story is told, it's told in the first person present tense. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. During the meal, the father will stand up and he will say something like, "We are slaves in Egypt. And our God has spoken to us through Moses. And our God is going to deliver us from slavery in Egypt. And our God is going to bring us into a land flowing with milk and honey that our God promised to our ancestors." Can you hear the difference? It's not, your people, they were slaves in Egypt way back then. And God did this and God did that. It's no, we are. This is a Jewish way of making the story our story. The first person present tense. The word know used here in the psalm is that intimate knowledge and experience of the story. It's something that is incredibly important. The second thing that the psalmist says, and this is in the first part of verse 7, is that they set their hope in God. Now you might say to me, well, that's obvious, and of course we set our hope in God, and my hope is in God, our hope is in God. But what's being spoken of here? Well, it's not just optimism. There's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is, I think it'll turn out all right in the end. I'm not really sure. I have no idea why I'm even saying that, but I just think that in the end, things will work out okay. The psalmist is not talking about that here. The psalmist is talking about hope, and the difference between optimism and hope is that hope is based on some kind of reasonable basis or premise. And the basis of hope for people of Judeo-Christian faith is that God has done something significant in the past, and so therefore God can be trusted to do something in the present. It's what we do every single time we meet together in worship. We sing songs, we pray prayers, we offer things to God on the basis that God has been there and delivered us and has been our hope in the past. It's the basis of our trust. We tell the story in different ways. We often have communion in our services. And one of the purposes of communion is to retell the old story, to remind us. I mean, let's face it, I've been in the church all my life. I sometimes say to people, the church has been in me longer than I've been in the church, because I was in the church when I was in my mother's womb. But do I need to be reminded of the story? Yeah, I do. I need to be reminded of the story. I need to be reminded of the basis of the hope that I hold. So it's more than optimism. It's a deep, deep hope. And that's really significant here in Psalm 78. So the psalmist is reminding people to retell the story. In the New Testament, Paul puts it like this. In Romans, he says, and you'll know these verses well, some of you, Romans 8:28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose." How can Paul say that? Because he knows that God has done it in the past. It's not an airy-fairy idea he just snatched out of the air. Paul is a Jew of Jews. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews. He knows the history of his people. He knows that God has delivered. And so with confidence he can say that God will work all of these things together for good. Hope doesn't mean that things will always be perfect. Hope doesn't mean that there'll be no struggles and difficulties. You know, there's a brand of Christianity out there today that says, you know, come to Jesus and everything will be fine. Come to Jesus and you won't get sick and you won't be poor and you won't struggle. It'll all be fine. That's the stuff of fairy tales. But what Paul is saying is come to God and it doesn't matter what happens. The good, the bad, even the really bad or the indifferent, God is with you. God has this in hand. The third thing that the psalmist reminds listeners of, people who are attentive, the psalmist says that they do not forget. It's the second part of verse 7 and into verse 8, that they do not forget. I think we're very prone to forgetting. Winston Churchill once said, apparently, when you're going through hell, keep going. Don't stop. If you stop, you're in trouble. Keep going. Keep moving. Now, I don't know what the basis of his statement was. I don't know what his hope was in. But, you know, often, or at least sometimes, in life we go through what feels like hell. I know in my experience of pastoral work, often I would hear sometimes horrific stories of people who had been or were going through hell. Some things that I'd never experienced and never wish to experience. But somehow they kept going, and often when you said to them, what was it that just kept you going and not giving up? And many would say because their hope was in God, that God could somehow bring them through this difficult experience. Like I said, it doesn't mean you avoid the difficult experiences, but it's in the difficult experiences that you discover your hope in God. So we are very prone to forget. But they're not just called not to forget. They're actually called to remember. And there is a difference, I think, between the two. I have 2 adult boys. And if you said to me, do you ever forget that you have 2 boys? Of course, my answer would be no. I never forget that I have 2 boys. But if you said to me, are you always conscious of your boys? I'd have to say no, not always. So they're not always in the forefront of my mind. But there are intentional times that I have where I recall the fact that they're my boys. And what that prompts me to do is it prompts me to pray for them. It reminds me that I love them deeply with all my heart. And it reminds me that they love me deeply with all my heart, even though they're such a long way away and I don't see them very often. So it's not just about not forgetting. It's actually about recalling it to our mind so that we're aware of God's love for us. We're aware of the basis of the hope that we can place in God. So what can we glean from this psalm that might encourage our faith to flourish? Well, I think the most important message from Psalm 78, Psalm 78 I should say, is, and we're reminded of, is in Hebrews chapter 11 in the New Testament, where the writer to the Hebrews said this, now faith is the confidence in what we know, in what we hope for, and the assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. The basis of their hope was in God. And if you read the rest of Hebrews 11, and again some of you are quite familiar with that passage, you'll know that it's often referred to as the roll call of faith. It's many, many people who trusted in God, put their hope in God, had faith in God, and their faith was rewarded. How was that the case? Because they remembered the story. They remembered the old story. They called it to their attention, and they listened with attentiveness to what God would say. When we recall the story, we don't necessarily need to use words. We can use all sorts of different media to communicate the story. But you know, the wonderful thing is that when we tell ourselves the story, remind ourselves of the story, when we tell one another the story, that's largely what we do in our worship services today. When we sing, Did you ever think about that? We're not just singing to God, we're singing to one another as well. We're telling one another the story. And I think there's very good reasons for that as well, because, we don't always know, but the person who's sitting alongside us or behind us or in front of us may be struggling to hold on to the story. They may be going through a difficult period of time where they think, I'm not sure I can trust in God. I'm not sure I can hold on to this. And sometimes we need someone to sing the song, to tell the story for us. It's a very helpful and encouraging thing. We're not to forget what God has done, and we need to find creative ways to retell the story. It's what we do as a community. It's why it's so important that we gather together as a community. I want to close this morning with a quote which comes from John Goldingay, who's an eminent Old Testament scholar, and he made this comment on Psalm 78. He said, this psalm recognises the crucial connection between the past, the present, and the future generation. Now, I think this last part is really critical. Only because it listens to previous generations does the present generation know who it is and how to live in the light of the reality of God. Let me read that last bit again. Only because it listens to previous generations does the present generation know who it is and how to live in the light of the reality of God. The stories we tell form our identities. And for us of Christian faith, the story that we tell is the story of Jesus. And the story of Jesus is based on the story of the Exodus and everything that God did in the Old Testament, or as I refer to it as the Hebrew Bible. So when we weave those two stories together with our own story, that results in hope. That results in us realising, like the people of old, that there is a God who actually loves us. There's a God who can be trusted. There is a God who is faithful. And even when we feel like God is not there, we can have confidence to say, but God is there. God is with us, Emmanuel. So I trust this morning that as you reflect on that, you would be encouraged to remember the story, encouraged to tell the story. And if you're not feeling this morning that you're part of that story, if you don't have faith in Christ, well, the invitation is there. One of the things that God has been doing since the beginning of time has been inviting people like you and me into the story of God. Saying this story, you may not know this story, but this story is your story. It's our story. It's the story of God and people. It's the story of God and creation. God invites you into that story. If you're a part of that story already and you wonder, like I often do, how effective am I in my witness for Christ? Do people see anything different in me when I am involved in these other activities with people who are not Christians? I have to remind myself that my life needs to tell the story. So when I'm loving and gracious and kind and try to reach out and try to express compassion, I need to trust God, that God will reach out through that. Telling the story, telling the old story again and again.